Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast. Today's episode, 54, thank you for listening this far, is a bit of an exploratory one. We will be addressing the concepts of decentralization versus specialization when it comes to team constitution or team construction. The subject, I think, is both interesting on the civilian or the citizen level, and I will make the argument that it is sort of ingrained into our cultural concept of teams and families and communities and organization, but then it is also impregnated, don't make a joke out of that, into things like how a military might look at team constitution, as well as the politics of centralization versus decentralization. The politics of centralization versus decentralization, or collectivism versus individualism. And so these are ideas that have political relevance, social relevance, individual relevance. It'll have impact on how we address and think about things like morality, and we'll at least at one point use sort of a logical framework to try to parse out distinct prepositions or claims about truth. Before we get started, if you are listening to this, by the time that you are listening to this, the skate deck pre-order is live. And this, if you are watching on YouTube, this is where you can get a visual representation of what it would look like. Why we are doing a skate deck is because, well, there is a little bit of the history of skating that has a rebellious nature to it, but also it's a topic of interest that's gained in my periphery over time. And also, we think it's a distinct statement itself to combine the message of what we're saying into an item that can be used as a piece of art, or it can be used as a piece of exercise. Skating can have its exercise states, physicality. And we have partnered with Orion Training Group to bring a pre-order of a skate deck, which, if you are not watching on the screen, is a redacted art piece that states human privacy is not your property. This is a reference to reference to our belief that privacy is a human right, and the proceeds of which this is a charity piece, the proceeds of which are going to the Firearms Policy Coalition, which, as we speak, are working to present legal and moral cases in a structure that can challenge the brace ruling by the ATF. Now, it could be a opportunity. Perhaps this is the day that we see braces become the dagger in the heart of the NFA, which will which will show essentially or force our American legal system to recognize that the distinction between a normal rifle and what they call an SBR is both arbitrary and capricious and should not be subject to regulation by an organization that is known as the ATF. And what we're looking at is taking everything that we make off of these skate decks, which are pre-ordering, available now, taking the proceeds, and that becomes a donation to the Firearms Policy Coalition. So if you're interested, you can head over to redactedllc.com or redactedllc.com/merch, and that's where you'll find the skate decks. They are $60 for a deck plus shipping, and that the proceeds of which do go to the Firearms Policy Coalition. And it is a 2-week pre-order, where the pre-order starts today, and we'll have 2 weeks and a couple days, because it's not really useful. It's not really ideal to end a pre-order on a Friday. But that pre-order will go through. We'll order the decks. We'll get them shipped to you. And thank you for your time. Again, that's redactedllc.com/merch. Now, on to the subject. We're talking about decentralization versus specialization. On its front, these two concepts or even not quite virtues, but these values, not even that, these ideas might not immediately be presented as in contradiction to one another. Decentralization is oftentimes referred to a leadership structure, a government structure, or a societal structure such that in contrast to what you would call centralization, and centralization meaning a coalescing of power and authority into a smaller and smaller body of people, or smaller and smaller group of institutions. This is a very long-standing argument and ideal represented in governments and in political theory and political philosophy, that argues something like decentralization would argue something like a maximally free and just society will move towards decentralization, or prioritize decentralization to minimize the corruption of power. It's a response or a rebuke of it is a rebuke of the centralization of power, saying that in the principle, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. The way that we as people counter that is we decentralize our government. And what decentralization looks like when baked into the American cake is states' rights versus federal rights, or states' rights versus federal control. And through the history of America, in many ways can be painted as, if you've read enough of it, as a slow, steady process towards continued centralization. Have we undergone periods where we've attempted to decentralize? Yes, but maybe no, because decentralization, in its effect, struggles with definition. And what I mean by struggling with definition is the more attention and coalescing of power is presented into a centralized area, the easier it is to look at and say, that's the government, that's over there. And the counter to it, maybe an argument against decentralization, is that it eventually becomes so ambiguous that nobody knows what is and what isn't government, or what is and isn't under their domain. It's a mutually aggressive it's a mutually aggressing issue of, just because decentralization occurs doesn't mean that it's good, and just because centralization occurs doesn't necessarily mean that it's evil. However, what we've recognized, or what we would argue if we're using decentralization as a principle, is that a government or human social structure, whether it's an organization like a this keeps opening on me, whether it's a human structure, or whether it's a government, or whether it's a community, or whether it's a kingdom, or whether it's a corporation, or whether it's a team element, the more that it becomes centralized, dependent on the actions of a few for the success of the whole, that not only produces weaknesses. For example, if your entire team is dependent on the will of the leader, and that leader gets taken out, now you don't have everyone's lost. Um, it also renders the act of centralization also renders the country or the organization to the abuses of the few. So, if you want to say democracy as an idea, the will of the people shall not be, or the will of the people is reflected in the government. Democracy is so much closer to anarchy in the sense that there is no government. Absolute decentralization, though, may not actually be anarchy. But that's a conversation for another time, perhaps, unless it has to come up here later. Again, this is a bit more of an exploratory subject, and we're talking about decentralization. So, when we see, let's take a corporation and use it as an example, or a company, or even a team. When we think of centralization, we think of all of the important decisions are made by a single individual, or a small group of people. Everything is dependent on the leader, and it might be dependent on the leader for logistics. It might be dependent on the leader for ethical decisions. It might be dependent on the leader for where to go, setting goals, making movements. And that and we can see the negative side of centralization when the leader is corrupt. However, is the same thing true for a decentralized organization? And we can see this play out in multiple different ways. There are things that we have, there are examples that we have in our contemporary lives, and then there are things within recent history, especially in the history of warfare, that identify the application of decentralization to the success or apparent success of the body, the people, the whatever. One example is presented in Jocko Willink's book Extreme Ownership, where he talks about decentralized leadership existing within his SEAL team, such that at any given moment, if the need arises, any individual within that team can rise to the occasion and become and function as the leader. So while there may be a normal a normal operating procedure where there is a leader who takes charge, who has decisions, who does have some final say in decisions that are made, at the ability of the team the abilities of the team members are all able such that they can re- replace him in an emergency. That might be a really good balance because it still does recognize that there is a leadership element, but the team is not wholly dependent on that one person at every given moment, at every given time, for every given decision. This also looks like in an application of Nicholas Nassim Taleb's skin in the game argument that the closer the person is to the problem, ideal in many ways, the more accurate and capable they are at assessing and handling the subject. So you can think about this with a military unit. If the leader isn't even on the field, how accurate are his decisions going to be? He might be privy to other information, such as movements of other units or certain goals that are unstated to the team, which becomes an entirely different ethical problem. But if that team is so dependent on the leader that they cannot even make decisions accurately, or no, if the team is structured such that even the people on the ground are not able to make decisions because they're controlled by things like rules of engagement that are so inhibiting to their decision making matrix that they have to integrate so many artificial factors into the situation that they become crippled, we see that decentralization can also look like trusting your men, building trust amongst a team from the leadership, or if there is a leadership, from the team as a whole, that people trust each other to make decisions both in high stress environments and in the day to day. But this might come in contrast in a way to this idea of specialization. Now, specialization is in some ways attributed to the Industrial Revolution. Before the Industrial Revolution, most societies, at least in America, were agrarian. That means in some sense you were responsible for so many things in your own environment. You were responsible for a very large set of skill sets, whether it's repairing your home to plumbing, or what would become plumbing, or growing your own food, or this, that, and the other. You might have a skill set that sets you apart from your neighbors, but in general, most people were participating in the act of producing food. This is a little bit of a simple oversimplification, but the idea of specialization, in some sense, at least the term and how we see it applied in many layers of society, was the production of the Industrial Revolution. However, this must come with a warning. The idea of the Industrial Revolution did not happen in a day. It wasn't like one day the world was all farmers and then the next day everyone worked in factories. In fact, it was a process of about 400 years. Over time, technology, whether it was the steam engine to the loom to the ability the train, to different forms of material production, to the translation of raw materials into finished products, to the shipping of those products, this process of what we call industrialization did not happen quickly. And as a result, excessive criticisms of industrialization become excessive, perhaps a little bit off base, when they don't take account for the grandeur, the large scale, step by step development of what we would call industrialization. But how does industrialization apply to the team? There is a trope, whether it's from the Lord of the Rings to video games to even the makeup of a military team, that addresses this idea of specialization. You have the leader, the assaulter, the breacher, the medic, the sniper. You have, you have all of these different people. You have the cook, you have the HVAC guy, you have the person who prepares the base, you have the base guards, you have the assaulters, you have the defenders, you have all of these different titles that are given to people. And in a military sense, we see how, in one way, a balance is attempted to be struck at different times, where an individual in a team might have a specialization, ergo the Marine Corps. Every Marine is a rifleman. While people will have specializations, things that they provide to the team, everyone can function on a similar baseline. This, though, is a question that applies to this question. It looks very differently when we're talking about the citizen. And that's where I want to go into a level of exploration. So let me explain. Enter all the memes there. How do we think of team and community construction or constitution outside of an overt military perspective, right? Again, gun culture draws a lot of its elements from the military, because the military does have a lot of influence over these things that involve guns, culture, defense, violence, so on and so forth. But we are entertaining and we are undergoing a lot of that cultural shift, where it's not enough to structure everything based on what was recently applied within the military. And that, in many ways, is what our generation is looking like, because we are undergoing massive cultural differences over time, some of them looking oppressive and averse. Why is it that one organization, such as like the CDC, gets to dictate the lives of all the people? Or why is it we find ethical questions when a small group of people in a room called the ATF make demands of the lives of everybody within the culture, according to what they can and cannot own, what they do and do not owe for taxes, IRS, and whatever? It's not so much to say that it alone is a problem, the principle, but also the application of it. Therefore, uh, tangent aside, what does the balance between decentralization and specialization look like on the civilian level? Let me first introduce a philosophical principle, a principle applied in philosophical conversation, that is the false dichotomy. A false dichotomy it is a criticism of an argument that says you are presenting a dichotomy, it must be one way or the other. It is a criticism of that argument. It is saying that you say to me, we are either decentralized or specialized, but we can't be both. And that dichotomy is false. One of the laws of logic, one of the three foundational laws of logic, is a thing is either true or it is not true. There is no third option. When we are talking about the specific language of logic, the objective of the language is to try to distill ideas, sentences, phrases, or arguments into a series of truth statements referred to as prepositions. And the reason why we are distilling those into truth statements is we are trying to break down the idea or the argument into such a fundamental level that each individual element of the argument can be understood as either true or not true. Now, when an argument because there are arguments about dichotomy, for example, a thing is either true or not true. When we criticize an argument saying that it has presented a false dichotomy, we are presenting something like, it is not the case that a person's political position must be either left or right. That is an example. It's either you are either with me or you are against me. I might make the argument that that's a false dichotomy. Another version of what could be criticized as a false dichotomy is, if you don't vote for person A, it functions as a vote for person B. Sometimes this is the case, sometimes it isn't the case. But why we are introducing the concept of a false dichotomy within the philosophy of violence, or within or the idea of decentralization versus specialization, is that the idea of decentralization, if taken to its logical extent, could not logical extent, if taken maybe down a road, one road, could come to the conclusion that every single person should focus primarily on being so decentralized that they are individual, that they are atomized, that they are they are capable of fully functioning on their own. The lone survivor idea, the prepper in the woods with the bunker idea, and the idea of what we call the prepper, and the idea of what we've referred to as the survivalist, has for many years focused exclusively on decentralization to the point of atomization. The only thing that I have control over is myself, and the only thing that I am therefore concerned about is my own personal well-being. This sort of selfishness combined with survivalism might be an ethical question there. At the same time that's happening, now, as the same time as this idea of decentralization ad infinitum, which is not exactly accurate, but you get the point if you do. That's not the right way of saying it, is it? It's kind of dismissive. I apologize. It's not meant to be that way. But this idea of decentralization, if taken ad infinitum, becomes closer to the idea of anarchism. And anarchism in recent times, because of the influence of people like Michael Malice, has argued a more principled approach, saying that you do not get to represent me at all in any way. It's sort of it's even a refutation of the idea of the republic, by saying, I don't give people permission to represent me. I represent myself. Now, you could make some criticism here, saying that how is that in any way different than, absolute democracy or the tyranny of the majority? Or how does that not end up becoming the tyranny of the majority, is a conversation for another time. But what it looks like within gun culture is, um, when we talk about the idea of wanting to have a community or people to live our lives with, or spend participation with, or invest time with, or whatever, even having relationships is sort of anathema, or in contrast to a rabid individualization. But the other side of it becomes this idea of, specialization. And specialization looks like, I'm the medic, you're the sniper, he's the leader, he's the breacher. And you might think of this idea of getting your friends together into a gang of friends, and everyone has their different specialties, and in like a video game-esque way, each person plays their role at just the right time to see the goal achieved. And I think that the fantasy of decentralization to the point of atomization, the self-isolation, is a fantasy, is a fantasy in just the same way that this idea of specialization is a fantasy. So the false dichotomy of being forced to choose between hyper specialization and hyper decentralization is that both of them are both of them are not so much in opposition to one another, but are examples of failing to establish a balance between the two. No team functions when members, are the weakest links, drag the team down so much that they cannot accomplish the goal. However, the idea that people could be, in a sense, different puzzle pieces to support, or even um, multiply their assets and capabilities as a team, because of complementary skill sets, can quickly produce these weak link problems. And let me explain. The idea of specialization is an interesting one. Let's talk about the ideas of specialization and what that might look like, and what specialization should be and shouldn't be within the team. So, when we think about a community, when we think about a group of people that have either a set goal or a set common value, this is our neighborhood, this is our town, this is our culture, this is our community, we might want to establish certain baseline expectations. And those expectations, in many, oftentimes come across in the idea of skill sets and gear. In order to be a part of gun culture, you need to own a gun. Is that true? Maybe. It's an ethical question that's being presented right now. But those baseline conditions might also be abstract objects. You must share the same value of individual responsibility. What does that look like? Great ethical question. It could be a little bit tyrannical, like the quote unquote FUD lore days of old, where if I'm suspicious of it, you must be irresponsible. Taken too far, we've definitely seen what that has done. But at the same time, let's look at how gun culture has approached gear lately. So there was this idea at one point in time that owning a gun was sufficient. Maybe that's still the case. But now you look at what gun culture is focused on lately, and it's being more capable of more things than just owning a gun. Maybe it's I'm capable of I'm capable of hitting my target. Maybe it's I'm capable of moving in the woods. Maybe it's I have medical equipment. I have a plate carrier. I'm able to move in my plate carrier. I'm able to treat an immediate emergency medical situation. Maybe it's I'm NBC capable to some extent, and then you got all the arguments on who's cooler than who, and let all that out the window. And so, this idea of has been on my mind for a couple of weeks, and you'll see this conversation reflected in a couple of the conversations in the shows upcoming. Next week we have Zach Stone and Isaac Botkin returns, so I hope you enjoy those. Zach Stone joins us on Monday. Isaac Botkin returns on Wednesday. I hope you enjoy those conversations, but in a little bit of both of them, we start addressing this idea of both decentralization within government and addressing skill sets and specialization of the individual. And that has led me down this road of considering what it is that specialization versus decentralization should look like within the team. Again, specialization might be something like we recognize of the four of us, one of us is much more skilled and proficient at precision long range shooting than the others. Okay, well, absent a goal, figuring out what that value is kind of strange, but that means that they have information that they can teach the group. Sure, that works, but that cannot be that is somehow not sufficient for justifying the existence of the group as a whole. And that's kind of the strange part of it. Decentralization might look like self-sufficiency. Specialization might look like I have a skill set that's marketable or valuable to my team. Decentralization, the principle of decentralization amongst a team on a team level will look something like each member of the team is capable of operating at a certain level. They're capable of functioning at a certain level. There's a certain standard. There's a certain gate that everyone must be able to pass through. See where the gatekeeping word comes in. This is the counterpoint issue to the problem of gatekeeping, but that's not for this day. Decentralization would argue that each person needs to be a fully self-sufficient unit. That means each person must be able to hit a target at this distance, be able to treat these kind of medical emergencies, that must be able to make certain movements within a certain amount of gear, with a certain amount of gear within a certain amount of time, must be in possession of maybe this kind of firearm or this kind of vehicle or whatever. Environments, teams, constitutions, goals change. In a community, it might look like I need each person of the team to not be in a case, it's a negative in a sense, not in such a case where they are solely dependent on everybody else without bringing an equal value and a value to the team equal to that which they take. This also oftentimes looks like a business interaction. At least in theory. Business majors can, rage at me Please let me know how wrong I am on this one. And so I think what is necessary on all levels of society is to establish an ethical principle. And that is and this is what I think it is. I think there is a false dichotomy presented, which means I brought up this, and I recognize fully the irony that I brought up the dichotomy, decentralization versus specialization, and then I claimed it as a false dichotomy. But I wanted to use this as an exploratory Friday solo to talk about how I'm starting to think about, and how maybe you can kind of comment or give me some feedback on how you thought about this idea of being specialized. I have a special set of skills that I can be an asset to the team, and how that exists within an environment, possibly within some tension of being decentralized to the point of each one of us is an individual node that can function on our own, but then in addition add value, which kind of gives away the principle. This is what I believe the principle should be. Individuals should, therefore, ethically, it's an ethical expectation. Individuals should be capable such that they are able to contribute to the group. Individuals should be capable such that they are able to contribute to the group. They are able, not required to. It's not able, not required to. They are able to. They are able to. And then what that ability looks like has room for conversation. Any team constitution must have a base level of self-sufficiency or should have a base level of self-sufficiency exhibited across all the team members, and what those things are is up for discussion depending on situation, mission, execution, so on and so forth. And by having that baseline, and part of that baseline is ethics, philosophy, and leadership capability, such that it maximizes the ability for the individuals to contribute with specialized skill sets and abilities to the group. And this means the group must be able to look at itself and say, this is what we are and this is what we aren't, and ascribe expected skill sets or abilities or capabilities or equipment standards or whatever you want to call it to its group, finding ways to make that possible, and then look to add specialization with the individuals afterwards. This does follow a bit of way that small team units, small team tactics have focused on in a while. Again, I'll go back to the Marine Corps. Every Marine is first and foremost a rifleman, and after that, he has another ability. Kudos to the Marine Corps for looking at this principle. There is still leadership structures. There are still different specializations that people have. There are still different expectations of different people based on their position within the team, the role they're playing, and whatsoever. But the ability for the team as a whole is such that they can adapt. Now, when applying this to civilians, this is where I think the question continues to get muddy. What is the new baseline? Is it, do you have a Baofeng radio? Is it that you know how to plug in comms? Is it that you have, an AR-15 and you have enough spare parts to survive, to last a certain time? Who decides these things? I am encouraged by conversations about what this looks like. Now, today, and what we're focusing on as a podcast is philosophy. We're trying to focus on the abstract objects, the abstract ideas of decentralization versus specialization, so that you and us in our own time off screen, when you're not listening to this, can focus on those things. I have been listening to, I think, S2 Underground lately talk about some of these different concepts when it comes to communications and directional finding and so on and so forth. And I think this is interesting to see how while we are watching the West in one way be kind of forced into decentralization, or maybe even naturally decay from a centralized power to a decentralized network. I don't know if decay is the right word, but because that even paints its own ethical layer on it. But what you can say is, if you believe that empires collapse, all empires must collapse, then you should be asking yourself the question: is our decentralization going to come willingly or unwillingly? Are we going to decay, or are we going to sort of retrench? Are we going to have a national divorce or a civil war? Maybe both. Are we going to engage in are we going to engage on the local level or the federal level? Are we going to address federal policies, or are we going to address local policies? How are these all going to work to each other? How are you an asset to you, yourself, your family, your community, your neighborhood, your friends, your families, your extended network? And and what that looks like is specialization. What I hope that specialization can look like is individuals solving problems for the group, bringing those to market, and finding ways to add value instead of simply tear ourselves down. With that, um, I want to hear what you guys think about what specialization might look like within a team, within a citizen environment. What does specialization look like for gun culture in a citizen, on the level of the citizen, where we are not in the situation of being in a military? And I'd be curious to see what that conversation. I'm looking forward to seeing what that conversation looks like. I want to know what I am encouraged and intrigued by what gun culture is going to do as it looks at these ideas of decentralization, maybe even libertarianism, and specialization as principles or objectives or ideas that are defining our day and age. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but I will make the argument that if we consider these principles, we will be better for it in our individual lives and our community. If we consider the idea of what does decentralization look like and when has it gone too far, and what does specialization look like and when has it gone too far, because specialization can lead to an oligarchy, decentralization can lead to anarchy. Centralization or specialization can lead to specialization can, if corrupted, turn into centralized authoritarian government. My specialization is I'm the leader. I am the expert, and we can trust the experts because they will never do us wrong. How do we raise the level? How do we raise our individual capabilities as participants in gun culture to raise the level of individual capability? This is, again, this principle buried within the Second Amendment. The right of the people, shall not be infringed. Is this argument being necessary to a free state? That if the population is prohibited from individual participation, it destroys the free state. And so instead of simply focusing outwards on what the tyranny is happening or what the government is doing or what the centralized government is doing, we also are looking at what we as individuals can do more in our environment. And some of that looks like, what is the foundation? What is the baseline? And what does specialization look like? Maybe you do have a special set of skills that are an asset to your community, but are you able to bring those to your community without being a greater burden because you have not presented yourself capable of the baseline? Specialization becomes very interdependent because I cannot, and we see this in our complex systems. And so the balance must be struck in one part on culture, another part on infrastructure, another part on the community, and another part on our government and our society and our gun culture. And that is the food for thought. This idea, I hope I was able to provide some pieces of information that could be planted in ways that we can think about these things that we're dealing with. I hope I was able to provide something that was of asset to you. And if that's the case, thank you for listening. If you are on social media platforms, thank you. If you are willing to leave a comment, especially on YouTube, it does help the algorithm, even though the majority of our audience, I completely understand, is on podcasting platforms. If you're on a podcasting platform, Thank you very much. We do have some interaction on our locals page. The locals page is redactedculture.locals.com. If you have joined us on locals, you'll notice that there is an opportunity on locals to support the channel through a monthly subscription. I think it's $5 right now. Planning on keeping. My goal, my hope is that this project is of value enough to you that you see value in community building through it. That being the case, this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. Thank you for listening. We'll talk to you soon.